All right. Well, it's 10 o'clock where I am in Austin, Texas in the US. So let's go ahead and get going. My name's Scott Fincher. I'm a data scientist on the customer care team here at KNIME. And with me today also is Lada. Lada, you want to introduce yourself right quick?
Yeah, my name is Lada. I'm a junior data scientist in the evangelism team based in Constance.
Thanks. So today, Lada and I are here to talk to you about best practices to build KNIME workflows. Before we get started, maybe just a quick, making sure we can go here, Lada. Sorry, our slides are a little bit wonky here at the moment. Maybe Lada, just have you control those on your side if you would.
Yep.
So just wanted to give a quick bit of housekeeping before we get going. We've scheduled the time here together in terms of the content we have for you for about 45 minutes. And we're going to have Q&A for the last 10 or 15 minutes or so of our session. If you have questions, please do post those in the Q&A session. We have Shantanu here on the KNIME team who's monitoring those questions, and he's going to group those up for us so we make sure we cover some of those at the end. I see some of you are already posting in the Q&A your location, where you're posting from, and we've got a pretty international group today. I see some people from Berlin, Italy, Boston, Toronto, several different places in Germany, actually, Amsterdam, Sweden, South Korea. Wow, welcome, Brazil. So thanks everybody for joining. It's good to have a worldwide crew with us. So people will always ask, is the session going to be recorded? Can I get the slides later? Can I get the workflow that you're going to show? Yes to all three. All of those are going to be available. We'll have the recorded session posted on YouTube in a few days, probably. We'll also send out a follow-up email to you that will contain links to the slides, to a forum thread where we can follow up with additional questions that we may not have time to answer at the end of this session, and that example workflow. So keep an eye on your inbox after the session is over for more follow-up. Having said that, let's go ahead and get into the next part. So what we're going to be talking about today is best practices specifically for workflows. You've probably created workflows in KNIME before, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And so when you start out this process, you have to ask yourself several questions for building, a workflow that's going to perform the best that it can. Is it efficiently designed? Is it going to work with new data? If you happen to bring new data into it, is that going to break something or not? Is it going to scale if you bring in large sections of new data, or will that break it? And if it does break, what are you planning to do about it? Can your workflow handle some inconsistent conditions? If it generates some errors, can you trace those errors so that you can actually follow up on them later? And then finally, is your workflow secure? Are you, somehow not intentionally leaking data maybe to people that shouldn't be able to access it, right? All things that we want to control for when we're building our workflows. Let's see, Lot, if we can go to the next one. Thank you. So building workflow is a little bit like telling a news story. A good piece of news should have, if you're reading on CNN or something, right? A clear introduction. A good piece of news should be concise. It should use its space adequately. It shouldn't be too long, shouldn't be too short. It should be just the right length to get across the defined aim and goal that the author of the story is trying to tell you. And so a workflow is a little bit like that. So when we create a KNIME workflow, we want to have a clear introduction too. This can mean efficient reading of input data. It also can mean proper annotation too, making sure that when you bring up your workflow or somebody else brings it up, that they can actually get an idea of what the workflow is supposed to do. You want your workflow to be concise in that it uses an appropriate selection of nodes to do the task that you have implemented. You want to use space adequately, and space in this analogy maybe refers to like memory or storage, right? We want to be careful when we consider our computational resources that when we use our workflow, it can run on the machines it needs to be able to run on. And then of course, we want to have a well-defined workflow scope, a defined aim and goal. What is our workflow intending to do? Let's keep it to that particular thing and not try and have some giant, huge workflow that's trying to be all things to all people, right? We want it to be pretty well defined. All right. So when we talk about the pillars of a good workflow, we're going to talk about these 4 sections: security, efficiency, which is something people really like to talk about. How can I make my workflow run faster? But also maybe something you may not have thought about as much: error handling. What do we do when stuff breaks? How can we prevent it in the first place? And then also reusability. How can we make it so that other people in our team can use our workflows, but how can we in the future also continue to use our workflows and not reinvent the wheel, right? So these are all things we're going to talk about today. So here's an example workflow that we'll use to motivate some of these sections that we're going to talk about. This is a workflow that does some ETL on customer data, and it does this pretty poorly in a lot of ways. You can see we have, one section for extract, transform, and loading, and we'll get into more detail about how this could be improved as we go through our different sections. So having said that, let's go ahead to the first section we're going to discuss. I'm going to pass it over to Lotta, and she's going to talk about security.
Yeah, so let's move to the first set of our best practices, which will help you to build your workflows more securely and more securely handle your credentials, your data, and the workflows themselves. And we start with the security considerations for handling the credentials. And the first one is pretty obvious. We obviously don't recommend you to store your passwords in plain text anywhere. So don't create tables or with a table creator or variables with a variable creator where you would create a fields or variables that would store your passwords in the plain text. Also, don't put your API key, for example, in a URL in a plain text. Also, don't attach any files of any formats that will contain your passwords in plain text. So it's pretty obvious why you shouldn't do that, because if you do so, anyone can copy, paste, and reuse your password. And the next recommendation might look not so obvious. So we don't recommend to hard code your credentials in nodes. What do I mean here? All the authentication and connector nodes usually provide you with several options how you can provide your credentials, and one of them that looks like the simplest one, where you don't need any additional steps, is this one where you directly provide your username and password. So we also don't recommend to do that, although the password is encrypted. First of all, because your workflow is a folder on your machine, and this folder then contains the file that contains all the settings for this particular node, and your password will be written there. It will be encrypted, but still it will be available in that file. And the second reason is that these nodes by default keep storing your password. So once you close the workflow and share it with someone, and someone else is opening the workflow, the password will be there, and they will be able to re-execute and reconnect to the source. So what are other options how to provide the credentials more secure? First of all, you can change the default behavior of KNIME. If you go to KNIME ini file, KNIME ini file is a file of settings that is located in the root of KNIME installation. You can provide this line to this file, and then by default, all these nodes will not store your passwords. And then once you close the workflow and either you open it again or someone else is opening it again, the password will be gone and you will have to provide it again. So you won't be able to accidentally share your password. This is the first option. And another option is you can use these two nodes, depending on whether you work in KNIME Analytics Platform or with KNIME Portal, web portal. You can use either credentials configuration or credentials widget node. So what these nodes are doing, you can also provide your username and password here. And they have this setting that allows you to decide whether you want to save password in configuration or not. By default, it's disabled, and that's what we also recommend to do, because then once you close your workflow and open it again, your password is not stored, and the new user of the workflow will have to provide the password again. What these nodes are then doing, once you provided your username and password, they create a flow variable that contains your credentials, and this flow variable is encrypted. and you can pass it to the next nodes, for example, to connector nodes. And here, instead of this direct username and password option that I said we don't recommend to use, you can use the credentials option, and then you can select this flow variable with your encrypted credentials here. And also, since those nodes are one of them is a configuration node, another one is a widget node, they respectively allow you to create a nice configuration dialog or a nice interactive view where the user will be able to provide only the relevant settings and will not see all other bunch of available settings. Some nodes don't support this option with the using credentials from the encrypted flow variable. This is relevant for such nodes as Google and Microsoft authentication nodes, but these nodes have embedded options how to handle your credentials. So, for example, there is an option that will store your credentials in memory. This option we recommend to use if you plan to use the node only once. The next option, custom, stores your credentials in the separate file, and then you can reuse those credentials. And we recommend to use this option if you connect to the source several times. And then there is an option node, which we don't recommend to use because it's doing exactly what I said we don't recommend to do. It stores the credentials in the node, and then once you close the workflow and open it again, the credentials are there. And if you didn't delete them, other people will be able to re-execute and reconnect to the sources. Also, this authentication nodes have the option to limit the scopes to which you connect, which is also a nice option. If you, for example, don't want to overwrite something accidentally, you can limit the available scopes. So that was about credentials. Let's now talk about how to handle sensitive or confidential data. You might know that KNIME Workflow is a folder on your machine, and I already mentioned it. And there is a folder data there where you can store all the data that you want to share together with the workflow. This is a very nice option if you want to share the workflow with someone and you want to make sure that people will be able to execute it again. But make sure that you don't store any confidential data inside of your workflow, so that people who shouldn't have access to those data don't have access to this data when you share the workflow, because all the data that is inside of those of that data folder, it will be always shared together with the workflow. And another recommendation here is always reset your workflow before sharing it, unless there is a specific reason not to. Why is it important? It is important because if you worked with KNIME before, you know that you can see the interim results after each node, after each executed node, right? So you can right-click and open the table and see the interim result after this particular step. And even if your credentials are not stored with the workflow, even if your connection to your data source is not active anymore, you will still be able to have a look at this interim results unless you reset your workflow. So if there is some confidential data, you will basically share it as well. Therefore, reset your workflow before sharing it. And then finally, for users of KNIME Server, if you share your workflows on the KNIME Server, make sure to use the permissions feature. It allows you to define who can read, who can edit, and who can execute your workflow. So this is our example workflow, and we mentioned that there are several issues with this workflow that we will try to eliminate during this webinar. And let's start with the security issues. So we have here two nodes that connect to data sources. First is the Amazon authentication, and another one is PostgreSQL connector. And what we did here is we provided our username and password directly in the nodes. So why is it bad? Because if I close the workflow and open it again, my credentials are still there. And if I share this workflow with someone, the credentials are still there. And here we have only two nodes that contain the credentials. But imagine if we have even more in different parts of the workflow, I can accidentally forget to remove some of them, and then I can accidentally share them. So that's why here we use the credentials configuration node. We provided our username and password here in the configuration of this node. We left this setting to default disabled, so that our password is not stored in configuration. And then once the workflow is closed and reopened, the password is not there. And then we pass this encrypted flow variable with the credentials to the PostgreSQL connector, selected in the PostgreSQL connector the option credentials, and selected the encrypted credentials here in the drop-down list. And the same is relevant for the Amazon authentication node. Back to Scott.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about efficiency then. How can we make our workflows run faster? So one simple way to approach this, you know, what's the first thing that you're often doing when you're building a workflow? You're reading in data in some way, right? So how can we efficiently read those files? So one of the things that you can do that's pretty simple is to remove redundant or unused columns at the very beginning when you just read in the data using one of the many reader nodes that we have. For example, the CSV reader, the file reader, the Excel reader, and so forth. They all have this transformation tab, which you can see highlighted there. And you can just uncheck the columns that you don't need, right? Get rid of those right at the very beginning so you're not carrying throughout the branches of your workflow. Something else you want to do is avoid reading the same file multiple times. This is especially something that beginners tend to do. They'll take, you know, their file that they want to reference several times in the workflow and just put it in there a bunch of times. Well, especially if that's a big file, each time you have to execute that CSV reader or whatever it is, it's taking time, right? We could just read that file once and then connect that file via different branches wherever we need it in our workflow. And you see an example of this at the bottom of this slide, where we have two CSV readers over here, one being read to the data anonymization component, one to the anonymization assessment. That's not necessary. What we could do on the bottom right of the slide is just use the CSV reader once to connect to both of those two components. And that saves the time that the CSV reader would have taken when it executes again. Something else you could do is if you happen to have multiple files with the same structure that you just want to concatenate into one big file, for example, maybe you have 10 Excel files sitting in a directory, you want to make one giant table out of it, you can use the files and folder option, which you see on the right hand of the slide, to be able to do that all at once. This is a little bit of a special case. It's for files with the same structure, but you can essentially do in one node what in the past it would have taken several nodes to do using a loop. So much more efficient there. In terms of design of your workflow, there's several things you could consider. One thing is not every manipulation operation that you're going to be doing with your data is going to cost the same, right? Like a good example of this is the joiner node. It's really easy to just use the joiner node to join tables together, even if something that you're doing is maybe only really a simple lookup. But for large tables, that can be really expensive, right, in terms of computation time. When maybe what you should have done instead is just do this or use the cell replacer to replace those few rows. It would run a lot quicker. So there's places in your workflows where you can think about using nodes that are going to be, you know, less compute intensive. Something else to consider would be only using loops when you absolutely need them. Sometimes there's no avoiding loops, right? You have to use them, but there's some places where maybe you can get away with the multi-column version of particular nodes for the math formula or the string manipulation. If it's something you're going to be doing the same operation on different columns, use those. Another example that I've used myself is using pivoting and unpivoting nodes. You know, you can unpivot, do an operation, and then pivot back and avoid using loops that way. So there's a few tricks to think of there. If you can avoid loops, it's a good idea, with the knowledge, of course, that sometimes you have to use them, right? Something else to consider in your design is that not every data type in KNIME uses the same amount of memory. Like strings, for example, take up more space in memory than integers do. So you want to think about the structure. What data types are you using as you're setting up your workflow to try and conserve resources, both memory and storage? Something else that you can consider is removing columns with constant values or very low variance values if they're not needed. If you're not going to be using them down the line, just get rid of them. Something else you could consider as part of your workflow design, removing redundant data earlier on in the process to make things more efficient. So here's an example, again, of where maybe the joiner node can get you into a little trouble in terms of efficiency. If I have two big files that I read in with these Excel reader nodes, I immediately join them together, all of the different columns and everything, and then do filtering after the fact. This is going to be slower than if I did the row filtering first to just get down to the rows that I need, and then joining only those important rows, right? I'm adding a node here and I'm adding a branch, but I'm potentially saving myself a whole lot of time. So there's the trade-off between, complexity in your workflow potentially and execution time that you want to consider when you're looking at design issues like this. Now here's some low-hanging fruit, some easy stuff that you can avoid. You definitely don't want to do this in any case, right? So you can have, for example, disconnected nodes or components. You see this one that's marked old workflow backup here. This is maybe a different iteration of the workflow you were working on earlier, and you decided, well, I'm not going to use that, but I don't want to quite get rid of it yet. You should get rid of it. It could potentially cause you problems and cause the workflow to fail if you try and execute this on the server, or if you try and call this with another workflow, right? Clean that stuff out. Don't be precious about it. Just get rid of it. Something else you want to think about is workflow branches that aren't actively needed. Like you can see from this data cleaning component down to the data transformation, this does a bunch of work in the data transformation component, which then downstream is never used, right? So this is going to slow down the execution of your workflow. It's not necessarily going to break it, but it's just doing a bunch of computing that doesn't go anywhere. So let's get rid of that too. Something else to think about, storing large files inside of the workflow. Sometimes you want to store files like maybe in Excel, that you want to use as a lookup table or something inside the workflow so you can refer to it easily. But if it's a large file that you end up not using, get it out of the workflow, because that's going to make the workflow take a long time to both load and save. So these are easy things that you can do. Just get in the habit of not doing them, I guess I would say. Something else for efficiency that we can talk about, there's a feature called streaming in KNIME. It's technically a beta feature, but it's actually been around for quite a long time, and lots of folks use it. The idea behind streaming is this. So normally in KNIME, when you run a particular node, you have to wait for that node to finish before any subsequent nodes can start. Like, if I run this data generator node, it's got to complete before the math formula can do anything, and the row filter has to wait on the math formula, and so on and so forth. So for particular operations, in particular transformation operations within KNIME, you can often do better if you use the streaming function such that the math formula node doesn't have to wait for the data generator node to complete. It can just wait for maybe the first 50 rows to come out, or the first 100 rows, whatever the batch size or the chunk size happens to be. It can take those rows and start doing stuff to them before the data generator has finished. And if you add up the incremental improvement across a bunch of different nodes using streaming, that turns out to be able to run quite a bit faster. If you want to use this within KNIME, you basically need to take the nodes that support streaming, not all nodes do, take the nodes that support streaming that you want to use and put them inside a component, change that component to use the simple streaming function. We have examples of this on the hub, so you can see exactly how it works if it's something you would want to implement, but this is another way potentially where you could save yourself some time during execution. So we've talked about these different ways that we can actually make our workflow more efficient, but how do we quantify that, right? We need to use the timer node if we actually want to know how long things are taking. And so the timer node is going to actually measure in milliseconds how long all of your different nodes, components, and meta nodes take to run, and provide you a table of that so you can see, where are my bottlenecks, right? Is this something that I could design a little bit better? Is it something related to a KNIME node, or is it something outside of KNIME? Am I, trying to access a remote resource, and for whatever reason, the network connection to that is spotty, and that's what's slowing things down, right? Maybe it's not KNIME at all. The timer info node can help you get an idea of where those bottlenecks are so that you can focus your attention to do something about them. So if you get in the habit of using this node early on, this will give you an idea of where those bottlenecks are. Now, something else we could think about with respect to efficiency is modularity. If I create modular workflows, then it's essentially taking one big workflow and breaking it into chunks. And the benefit here over one large workflow is that I can have those individual workflows perform individual tasks, and they're going to load faster. They're easier to maintain if I need to spread this out amongst other folks on my team. They're easier to test. So there's a lot of benefits to building your workflow in this way. One of the ways that you can do it in your master workflow would be to use a call workflow service node, which is essentially, if you follow the arrows, going to call out to a sub workflow. We use these special workflow service input and output nodes to pass the data in and out. And then maybe this sub workflow does, some data preparation in a component, whatever that is. The results are passed back to the master workflow. So I can compartmentalize by dividing and conquering different functionality, split those out to different workflows, and start thinking about workflow orchestration. You can also do this in the KNIME Server too, as opposed to just the analytics platform, by using the execution dialog, where if a particular workflow fails, it calls another workflow. If it succeeds, it calls a different workflow. So there's different approaches depending on whether you're using the analytics platform or server, but this is something you would want to think about, particularly implementing modularity and breaking your workflow up into chunks. So let's talk too about efficient usage of databases just briefly here. So a lot of us are going to be using database nodes within KNIME to connect to tables, get extracts of information that we need. You're going to want to make sure that if you're not already, that you're using the newest DB connectors. You see at the very top, there's a DB connector and also a database connector. Anything in KNIME labeled DB is a new node, and the older nodes say database, and they also will generally say legacy under them as well. There's you're not going to want to use those for new workflows. Those are basically included still in KNIME for backwards compatibility reasons. They still work, but they're not going to be as efficient as the newer ones. So use the new DB nodes. Another simple thing here, avoid using a DB connection node multiple times when you're connecting to the same database. Just like we saw with the different file reader nodes, you only want to make that connection once and then use multiple branches downstream as it's needed. Something else you'll want to think about is pushing processing to your database server when you can. Avoid doing that processing locally, because chances are the database server has much more horsepower than your laptop or your desktop does, right? So make it do the work. And you can do that by just using the proper nodes in the proper order. Like in the middle of this slide here, you see a DB table selector. We get an extract from a database, we read it back into KNIME, and then we do the row filtering and grouping in KNIME on our local system. Not so great when what we could do is do that same row filter and group by on the database server itself using the DB nodes, and have that processing pushed. So that's something to get in the good habit of getting familiar with what DB nodes are analogous to the regular KNIME nodes and where you can replace those in your database-centric workflows. And then another little tip at the end, you always want to use the DB connection closer at the end of your database processing. So what does this look like in practice on our example workflow? There's a few things to look at here. Like you can see on the next slide, the DB insert node, this has a database connection that's not closed. Again, not good. We also on the next slide have some meta nodes here that don't do anything useful. On the right-hand side, you have the orphan kind of check the uploaded data, which isn't connected to anything input. And then you have the old transformation on the left-hand side, which doesn't go anywhere. Let's just get rid of these. And there's another one here. There's the duplicate row filter in the middle that does deduplication after the transformation. And that's inefficient because we should be doing the deduplication before we do our joins and our string conversions and all that stuff. So doing this the kind of slow way, we get a timer info node. It tells us in total about 13 seconds. But if we make some strategic changes here, we can get that time to about 3 seconds, where we close our database connection after we load. We get rid of those orphan branches that aren't needed and don't go anywhere. And we do our deduplication of our rows earlier in the process. You can see that duplicate row filter moved up. So just by thinking a little bit about some of these things we talked about, you can see it's easy to get a really large decrease of the amount of time it takes for even a simple workflow like this to run. So let's go ahead and move on here, Lada, to the next section on error handling. I'll pass back to you.
Yeah, thank you. So If you want to deploy a workflow, put it in production, and if your workflow is supposed to run regularly, and especially if it connects to some external services or data sources, you might expect that sometimes there will be some errors that will happen, and you might want to handle those, set up some error handling frameworks already during the development of the workflow. So the errors that are probably most expected are the errors that happen when you connect to the web services. And therefore, in all our REST nodes, we have the tab that is called error handling, and it allows you to set up the behavior of the node directly in this tab, and it allows you to define different types of behavior depending on the different errors. So for example, you can say what you want to do in the case of one error, whether you want the nodes to fail or output missing value, or you want to set up some retries. If yes, how many retries, and whether you want to set up a delay. So it's very convenient because it's already inside of the node. For all other nodes, we recommend to use the try and catch nodes to allow for a graceful exit in the case of errors. And if we have a look at this screenshot here, we will see that if we don't handle errors anyhow, once some node fails, the whole workflow fails without informing anyone. And if we put our nodes inside of the try and catch framework, we can provide the alternative data and the execution can continue. In KNIME Analytics Platform, we have different try and catch nodes with various ports available, and also one node with the generic ports that can be used for any KNIME port type. Also, as I said, you can continue execution with alternative data. What you also can do is you can use the metadata that catch errors node provides in the form of flow variables in order to inform responsible people about a failure. So this node provides you with the information about which node failed and with which message. So you can then set up a check that will check whether there were any errors or not. And in case there are some errors, you can notify responsible people either with the send email node, or we also have the community extension for Slack, and then you can create the dynamic messages that will also change depending on the metadata that catch errors node provides. Also, you can set up the retries. For that, you need to put your try and catch construction inside of the loop. It can be either recursive loop, or it can be a counting loop start and variable condition loop end nodes. And you can specify two things here. First of all, the number of retries and also the ending condition of the loop. So if you successfully connected to your data source, then you don't need to retry again, right? You can close the loop right away. But if there was some failure, you can retry several times unless you succeed. And also, it might be useful to set up a delay between the retries. For that, you can check whether there was an error or not. If not, you can continue and just close the loop right away. If there was some error, you can set up a delay with the wait node. So another group of errors that can happen are the errors that don't break your workflow. So nothing really fails, but some wrong data comes in and then gets uploaded to the database, for example. So make sure to validate your input data so that your workflows are using only the correct data. You can do that with such nodes as JSON schema validator or table validator to validate the JSON objects, schemas, or tables respectively. But you can also actually set up any kinds of checks to check the number of rows, whether it's expected or not, or something similar. So let's go back to our example. We already fixed the security and efficiency issues. And now let's have a look what happens in case something breaks. So, and the first error here is happening when we tried to get the data from Amazon S3. So something failed, and what happens? The execution stops, and no one is getting informed about it. So that's one situation. Another situation that is actually even worse: nothing broke, but your data is not as it is expected. So you have here the column email that you might want to use as an identifying column, and therefore missing values shouldn't be allowed in this column. But for some reason now you got the data with the missing values, and you proceeded till the uploading this wrong data to the database. So how can we handle these errors? First of all, we can put the whole workflow in the try and catch nodes. And then once something breaks, our execution stops, because in this case, it doesn't really make sense to provide some alternative data, right? Because we want to get new customer data. But what happens is we check whether there were any errors. In our case, there was an error, and we send an email to the responsible person with the relevant message that gives this person information what happened. But if you have some alternative data with which you can proceed, of course, you shouldn't stop the execution, and you can just proceed with the alternative data. And then we also set up the validation of the input. And then you remember this second error that I showed, that we had missing values in this second branch. Now in the table validator, we can set up that it fails when there are missing values in the specific column, and now it fails. And again, the relevant email with the relevant message is sent to the responsible person. Okay, so back to Scott about reusability.
Okay, this is the last section we want to talk to you about today, reusability within KNIME. And there's a couple of concepts I think we want to focus on for this section. So first one is you want to make use strategically of configuration and widget nodes to help make your workflow flexible. Configuration and widget nodes are going to allow interaction points for end users of your workflow to be able to do things like enter their credentials, or make selections for columns, or however you define them. There's a whole bunch of configuration and widget nodes, but add in that flexibility to allow people to kind of self-serve as they're using the workflow. Something else we want to think about too is we want to be sure that our workflow is going to work everywhere, not just on our local machine where we developed it, right? So that's going to entail using relative paths instead of local paths, and we'll talk about how that works. And in a broader perspective, how can we use the KNIME file handling features that we introduced so that you can not only define relative paths, but also more easily connect to remote resources, for example. So let's start there first. On the next slide, we're going to talk about file handling. So at the top here is an example of using the Excel reader. And I could just use the Excel reader to point to, some file on my local system, C/users/Scott, whatever. But that's probably not great, right? Because anytime I hand that workflow off to someone else on their machine, it's going to break. So what we can do instead is use a relative workflow path. And you see that in the top right here, the Excel reader has a dialog where I can select relative to my current workflow data area, for example, or relative to several other locations that are available to me. In the past, you would have had to know a little bit of special KNIME syntax to set up this relative reference, but now we just do it via the dropdowns. And you're going to want to get in the habit of using these relative paths, especially if you're going to be moving data with your workflow. If I include a data set, an Excel file that I want to use as a lookup table or whatever within my workflow, put it in that workflow data area, point to it with the relative feature, then the workflow is going to work no matter where I run it. So this is something that's worthwhile to play around with if you haven't used it before, because it's pretty powerful and makes your workflows definitely more accessible. Now, if we want to talk about file handling in the context of connecting to remote resources, whether that's Azure or Google or Amazon or Databricks or any number of things, right? This is where the dynamic input port comes in, because you see this Excel reader down in the very bottom. It has this blue square input port on it. We turned that on by clicking the 3 little dots and adding a dynamic input port. And what that does is allows us to connect some other nodes upstream so that we can authenticate against Amazon, make our connection to S3. And now if you look at the dialog, instead of it being relative to, a local workflow data area or something, you can see it's a little grayed out. It's connecting to Amazon S3 directly. So we could read the Excel file directly from a remote resource. The file handling nodes are going to help you do that too. So getting familiar with this and using it regularly is also a good best practice. And on the next slide, we see, go into all of this, but this just gives you an idea of what some of the possibilities are, right? The top left is how can we read data from a local file system or a KNIME server with appropriate mount point references. On the top right, we see how we could actually, for example, move files across cloud environments. If I have a file in Google Cloud that I want to move over to an S3 bucket, then here's how I would do that, effectively using the transfer files node from KNIME, again, with those appropriate dynamic input ports set. And there's some other examples too, moving files within the same cloud environment, moving files on premise between your KNIME server and some other server with an SSH connection. All of this stuff is supported using the file handling framework. So if you haven't used it already, we have a pretty extensive blog post that covers all the different nodes that can be used here, how they're intended to work together, that you can follow up with. Stepping back for a second to something that's more simple, but is not something that everybody does. It's the idea of workflow organization. How can I actively organize my workflow to make it more readable and make it more understandable? So a simple thing that you could do, and I hope you do this, if you from the very beginning of each workflow, think about annotating not only your nodes, adding comments, like you can see the file reader here. I've added some text about where this file comes from and what it is. You can also add annotation boxes, so you can draw colored boxes around groups of nodes and add text that highlights what it is those nodes are intended to do. Why is this important? Well, it's like writing code, right? You need to leave comments in your code, not only for other people that have to come after you and use, your workflow here, but also for yourself. Be kind to your future self so that when you open up your workflow in 6 months, you don't have to beat your head against the desk and remember what it was you were doing. Get in the habit of properly annotating things so that anybody that uses your workflow can pick up right away and say, oh, okay, I know what he was intending to do here. Now, as far as organization, some other things to think about here too is the idea of encapsulation. So there's two ways to think about this. One is a little bit of a simpler way. You can use a meta node, which you see in the bottom right of this slide, to just tidy up your workflows, right? Let's say I have a whole bunch of transformation nodes. I'm doing row filtering, column filtering, group by pivoting to organize a bunch of data. And I just want to abstract that complexity away from the top level of my workflow. I put it inside a meta node and I just say, this is my transformation node, right? I can always double click and go inside to see the dirty details of what I did. But at the top level, sometimes it's nice just to see transformation or whatever function it is, right? Now, if it's some functionality that you're going to need to reuse, something you're going to be doing over and over again, like connecting to a database, doing an extract of a table, and performing very specific ETL functions, you need to log in and do that every day for some workflow that you're building. In that case, take the time to compartmentalize all your nodes into a component, and then you can share that component. You can share it with yourself locally so that you have access to it in your KNIME Explorer. You can drag that component into your workflow just like you would any other node. You can also share your components via folks or via the KNIME server for other folks on your team so they can use your component and they don't have to rebuild something you already did, right? Don't reinvent the wheel. Use components to help with that. And on the next slide, there's even more you can do with components apart from just the idea of sharing them, although that's certainly very important. But this goes back to the idea of adding interaction points, like I mentioned with the configuration nodes before. In this example, we take this process that's repeated often on the left-hand side, where we're going to pick between writing to either an Excel writer or a CSV writer. We're going to take a file and write it to some format. We'd like to give the user of the workflow the option to choose. So we can put this functionality inside a component, which you see in the middle, add a configuration node to generate a flow variable to determine what's going to happen. And what this is going to look like for the end user is they're going to see just a file writer component, which to them just looks like a special custom node, right? It even has a dialog that when they click on it, they're going to be able to pick what they want, write the table into Excel or CSV. Share this component on your KNIME server. That way, whenever somebody needs to do this, it's already done, right? It's a node that's already been built, and you saved everybody a lot of time for this reusable, repeatable process. So if you think about this beyond just workflows that you might create in the context of what's going on in your organization, then things become even more interesting, right? Because maybe your company has best practices and procedures like, this is how we connect to databases in a specific way. This is how we do ETL. This is how we log our processes. This is how we use APIs to go out and reference external resources. You can take those very specific operations, put them inside a component, and use the components to help drive your company's own standard best practices and procedures. In the process of doing this, you're using the DROI, don't repeat yourself principle, because components help you do that, right? Don't reinvent the wheel, because you've got this small, independently testable unit of functionality that you can spread out across all sorts of different workflows. Let's go to the next slide here. I won't go over the interest of time into all of this stuff, but when you are building components, if this is something that you're going to do in the context, again, of your organization, there are things you want to keep in mind. You want to make sure that a component that you build has a single function or responsibility, just like a node does, right? You want to make sure that its inputs and outputs are consistent and can be validated. Certainly, any components that you build, if they're going to be reused, shouldn't rely on the workflows that use them in order to function properly. They should be independent. They should be self-contained. You should just be able to drag them in and use them. They're not going to be dependent on specific data sources. And also, just like we would with our workflows, you want to get in the habit of properly documenting your components, making sure that you've got that text description in there, that you've got labels for your input and output ports, that it's clear inside the component what the different parts of the component are doing. All of that is best practices for when you're actually building the components themselves. So let's just, as we're wrapping up here, take a look at our kind of bad workflow and see how we can improve it. So right away, when I see this workflow, it's kind of melts your head a little bit. There's so much going on here. What am I supposed to even be looking at, right? We essentially have 3 different processes in this workflow that we can see with the annotation boxes: the extract, transform, and load. But it's just a lot to look at. And the bigger your workflows get, as you know, the harder they are to maintain. So if we can strategically use components here, there's ways we can make our lives easier. There's some other things going wrong here as well. If we zoom in a little bit, we can see the CSV reader is using this absolute local path, which means, right, if I hand this workflow off to somebody else, it's going to break. We should be using relative paths here instead, because this isn't reusable. And then lastly, the credentials configuration dialog. Apart from just a place where we can enter the username and password, there's a bunch of other options here that are exposed that we may or may not want to expose. So we could simplify this for the end user of the workflow. So what could this look like if we clean it up? Well, for one thing, we could compartmentalize those different sections, extract, transform, and load, into their own components. Since those are logical sections, that automatically makes this workflow a lot more readable just off the top. But also we can go in and fix some of those other issues. If we look inside the extract component, you'll see all that functionality is still there. It's just abstracted away. It's not quite as hard to absorb and look at. Further, that CSV reader node we want to fix, make sure that we're using the relative path, just like we saw before, so that it can run on any system. And then lastly, this credentials configuration node is going to expose just the credentials that we care about. For example, where do I provide my Amazon credentials? Here, somebody can, or their Postgres, same thing, right? They can just type those in when they use the workflow, and they don't have to worry about the additional configuration options. Okay, so what have we covered today? The pillars of a good workflow, all 3 of these things: how we can keep things secure, how we can make our workflows run quickly and efficiently, how we can deal with errors when we see them, making sure that we avoid our workflows breaking, and then also the idea of reusability, in particular with components. How can we avoid reinventing the wheel? Last thing, before we wrap up and do our Q&A session, I did want to mention to you that we have coming up another event next week. For those of you who are in North America, where I am, we're going to have a Data Connect event. What is that? It's essentially a learn-a-thon where we're going to split into 3 different groups. One group's going to deal with ETL and data blending. One group is going to learn about machine learning models, predictive algorithms with some of what we have available in KNIME. And then the last group will focus on model deployment and building data apps using KNIME. We'll have KNIMers there to walk you through all this and lots of other community members too. This is going to be from 5 to 8 p.m. Central Time, Chicago time, next Wednesday, February 23rd. And if that's something you're interested in, you could use this link. It'll be sent out to you also with the summary email that comes. Come join us. It'll be a fun event. We'll be on GatherTown running around with little virtual avatars. So you'll have the ability not just to chat with KNIMers and work with us, but also everybody else that's there. Having said that, that's all the content that we had for you today. I think now, Lada, it's probably time for us to go and check the Q&A and see what's come in. So let me scroll down here and see. Oh, okay, here's a good one. When we're thinking, Lada, about error handling, there's a question that says, what is the meaning of retry? If there are errors in my workflow, doesn't it mean that the configuration of nodes needs to be changed?
Yeah, so that's only relevant for those cases where retry can help, obviously. So for example, if you connect to some external resource, for example, to some web service that or a database that might be down at this particular moment, you can retry a little bit later and it can work. But of course, if there is some error in your workflow, for example, some unexpected data came in, you need to fix the workflow, and retries will not help there.
Yeah, it's all about connecting to those remote resources where you can't predict ahead of time where something might fail, right? Sometimes you're just not in control of that. And so using the try catch is a way to approach that problem without your workflow completely breaking down. Let's see, there was another question here. When I want to remove duplicates, I've seen that the group by is faster than the remove duplicates, which is a little bit of a newer node. Should I keep using group by? It depends, right? In terms of efficiency, it's going to depend on your data structure. Just for those of you who don't know, we haven't always had the remove duplicates node. The only way in the old days there used to be to do that was to use the group by. So that's a little bit of a trick that not everybody knows about. If for some reason you're noticing that the group by is faster, I'd say, yeah, just use the group by, right? But I do think it's going to depend on the structure of your data. Let's see here. What else? Oh, here's a good one. There's a question, is there a function or an operation within the analytics platform to search for dead ends in complex workflows? I don't think there is. And that's a really cool idea, actually, because if you have a workflow, I could see certainly with, hundreds of nodes in it and several different meta nodes, trying to find those dead ends might be a little cumbersome. So maybe that's something that I can pass on to our product management team and see if there's interest for developing something like that. That's a good idea. Another question here, is there something like version control? So yes, if you're using the KNIME server, we have what we call snapshots on the KNIME server. So you can upload different versions of workflows, take snapshots of them, and then basically look at the history of the workflow over time, along with comments that people make along the way to say, here's what I changed, here's what I moved around. And that allows you to revert in the history of a workflow. If you find something is broken, you can revert to an older version. So, but that is a KNIME server feature. That's not something that you can do in the analytics platform. Now, in the analytics platform, you can do diffs between two different workflows. That's the workflow compare feature, where you can essentially select two workflows in the KNIME Explorer and right-click and select compare. Then you can see how two workflows are different, but that's not quite the same as version control, right? So version control is more of a server feature. Lada, did you see anything here that jumped out at you that you wanted to try and answer?
Yes, I see one question. What's the best practice to read the same file multiple times into far apart nodes in the workflow to avoid dragging and extensive connection lines? So I would still recommend to read the file only once, but instead of dragging those connections, you can, for example, use the hotkeys like Control-L. You need to select both nodes that you need to connect, and then you can just simply click Control-L, and then they will get connected. So that's on Windows. On Mac, it's probably Command-L, but you can play around, there should be a way to connect them without dragging.
Yeah, and I know in the past, because sometimes, right, if you use one reader node or one connector node, then you can sometimes have branches that kind of go all over the place, and people don't want to have spaghetti workflows, right? And that's sometimes a motivation for why they introduce multiple readers in multiple times. So that's a trade-off, right? Like if you want to have a neater workflow and actually reading in the file multiple times isn't a big consideration because it's a small file, then do it, right? It's not hurting anything. But we have had in the past other requests for things like wireless connections, for example, where you could connect two nodes without actually seeing the branch between them. And that's something we thought about. I mean, no promises about whether that'll happen maybe in a future version of KNIME, but in an effort to have fewer spaghetti workflows, that's something that's come up a lot. So if some of you are thinking about that, know that we have heard you, and we're thinking about good ways to make the UI have a good experience for everybody. Any other questions here? Here's a quick one. What's the best way to connect KNIME and Power BI? There's actually specific nodes for Power BI that you can download. I think they're in their own extension. If you search for Power BI on the KNIME Hub, you'll find them. But you can then do a bunch of ETL data processing within KNIME, get a nice clean data set, and take it and push that to Power BI if you want to do visualizations there, right? So it's just a few different nodes. You can search for those. We have similar nodes for Tableau as well, and TIBCO. Okay, let's see. Let's see if we can find one more good question here to answer. Did you have any others that you saw, Lada?
So there is one, for example, that is asking for best approach to contain credentials in a workflow without them being visible to other people when exporting and sharing a workflow. So I think if you either write it in plain text or provide a password in the password field in any connector nodes, as I said, it will always be visible, even if it's going to be encrypted. But I don't know, maybe if you use your personal encryption, then maybe you can share, but otherwise it will be always visible. So if you want to store your credentials somewhere, maybe it's better to store them in a separate encrypted file and not share that file.
Okay, and then we'll end on this one, I think. Before I answer this, I'll just notice that all these other questions, and we still have several that we just don't have time to answer, we'll follow up with on the KNIME forum. On the KNIME forum, we'll have a thread dedicated to this webinar, and we'll post additional answers there. So don't feel like we won't get to them, because we will. The last one I wanted to answer here, it says, where can I get resources to study KNIME so I can sit for the KNIME certification exam? Probably the easiest way to study KNIME is to use our free courses that we have available via our learning management system. If you search for KNIME courses and go to the self-paced version of those courses, you can basically just need an email account. You can register for free, and then you can go through some lecture material, video material, and exercises to practice what you would need for the KNIME exam. We also periodically host live events where we teach our courses live, hosted by instructors like Lada and others from our evangelism team. And those usually take place over the course of a week, and you can learn KNIME that way too. So lots of different options for you there, but definitely check out our courses available, free or paid, whatever works the best for you. Okay, with that, I think I'm going to wrap up. Thanks everybody for joining. We appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully we will see you at a future KNIME event. If you're in the US like me, maybe the Data Connect event next week. Thanks everybody very much.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.